Hello everyone, I'm David Černý from the Institute of State and Law of the Czech Academy of Sciences and from the Institute of Computer Science of the Czech Academy of Sciences. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share with you my ideas about the role of age in the context of autonomous vehicles, or AVs for short. In my talk, I'm gonna address the issue of whether distributing harm in the context of AVs based on age is a kind of discrimination or not. First, I'm gonna present a general definition of direct discrimination. Then I'm gonna present the basic contours of the deprivation conception of the badness of death. And finally, I'm gonna apply all of this to the problem of harm distribution in the context of autonomous traffic. So, what is discrimination and why it should be rejected? I'm gonna start with the second part of this question, as it is much easier to answer. At the level of values, rejecting discrimination is based on the idea that all human beings are equal in their freedom and rights, as explicitly stated by the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. All humans, here I'm quoting, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But again, what is discrimination? I'm gonna strive to present a definition of discriminating action, but we must keep in mind that finding a definition of a certain form of human action is an uneasy task. Our own experiences show that the boundaries of the concept of discrimination are vaguely defined, and we can easily find ourselves in a situation when we will not be sure whether a certain action is an instance of discrimination or not. And for this reason, in my search for a general definition of direct discrimination, I'm gonna focus on a paradigmatic example of discrimination, which is racism. When a member of a certain race acts differently with respect to members of other races, then she acts with respect to members of her own race. So, if she, for example, meets someone of a different color, she treats him dismissingly, roughly, or even violently. And within this basic characterization of discriminating action, it is possible to analytically distinguish the individual marks comprising the content of the definition of discrimination. Okay, now, since I don't have enough time to go through all of them, I'm gonna skip some steps and show the definition of discrimination I have arrived at. But first a clarification, I'm gonna make use of some symbols. X stands for agents, ABC for individual human beings, P for they properties, phi for human actions, and finally p in parentheses for the class of all human beings sharing the property p. Now take a look at the definition of direct discrimination, which runs as follows. The action phi of the agent X is an instance of discrimination if the following conditions are met. First of all, X treats members of P differently than she treats members of non-P. Second, members of P are worse off as a result of phi, of the action phi. Then members of P are deprived of some good G. Members of P are worse off than members of non-P, and X treats ABC differently because ABC have the property P. And lastly, the property P has no relevant link to the action phi. Okay, well, now I think that the condition 4 needs some clarification and explanation. So consider the following two scenarios. Scenario 1, X lays off a person A, which is the action phi, because A has the property P being a bad employee. And now consider the scenario 2, in which X lays off person A because A has the property P having a black colored skin. Now, X's action phi was laying A off, but the property P, to be a bad employee, is relevantly linked to phi. We have good reasons to actualize phi based on that property P. Now, let us imagine that P stands for the property to have black colored skin. X lays A off because A is P, but there is no relevant link between phi and the property P. So there is no good reason justifying phi based on P. X can perhaps claim that she had good reasons for the layoff. She could say, for example, that A is P and that she just is uncomfortable with that for some reason. But even if X has some subjective reasons for phi, which she takes to be good, this doesn't mean that the reasons are really good. The color of one's skin does not determine one's abilities and efficiency, nor one's loyalty, and therefore it does not justify the layoff. So even though in both scenarios the action taken by X can be described in the same way as a layoff, only in the second scenario it represents an instance of discrimination, because the layoff is not relevantly linked to the property having a black colored skin. So, after having laid down a definition of direct discrimination, we can now turn our attention to the problem of the badness of death and ask the question, can death be bad? This question is by no means new, but recently it has become the subject of a fairly extensive philosophical debate, which is at present still going on. The answer is relevant not merely on its own, from a purely theoretical point of view, but is projected on other spheres of philosophical reflection, including applied ethics. I will try to show that the problem of discrimination based on age must in some cases be solved with reference to how this question is answered. So, can death be bad for those who are dead? It can, of course, be bad for those who are still alive, as we all are painfully aware. But what about those who have passed away? Many of us would say that when we die, we no longer exist, and we cannot experience anything. Nothing touches us, and nothing disturbs or pleases us. Death is a state of experiential emptiness. It definitively concludes our life story and the possibility of any kind of experience. So, how could death be bad for us? Our intuitions, or at least my intuitions, but I guess your intuitions are very similar, are pushing us to the conclusion that death cannot be bad. And in fact, a powerful argument for the conclusion that death cannot be bad can be put forward. So let's give it the following structure. First, at the moment of death, every human being ceased to exist. If one holds, then death cannot negatively or positively affect the contours of our welfare. If death cannot negatively affect our welfare, then death cannot be prudentially bad for us. And therefore, and that's the conclusion of the argument, death cannot be prudentially bad for us. By welfare, I here understand the good life, what life is like for those who live it. By prudential values, I understand those values that positively or negatively affect our good life. Final values are prudential values that affect welfare directly, immediately, while instrumental values are good or bad in a mediated way, by being a part of some chain of values terminating in some final value. The first premise of the argument is based on what is called the termination thesis. Simply put, death is the end of our existence, which I endorse here without discussing it. The second premise seems evident. If we do not exist, then it is not possible for our life to go better or worse based on some events or states influencing the contours of our good life. So, if we don't agree with the argument's conclusion, which is death cannot be bad for us, then we must focus on the premise 3, which can be given a more general form. If X cannot positively or negatively affect our welfare, then X cannot be bad or good for us. However, I will try to show that this premise is flawed and persuade you that some events can be good for us or bad for us, even if they in no way affect our welfare. So let's take a look at the following scenario, which I call check. Adam has a rich uncle of whose existence he knows nothing. Just before he dies, the uncle sends him a check for a large amount of money, which gets lost along the way. Adam never learns that he had an uncle, and he also never learns that the uncle sent him some money. We would probably say that the fact that Adam did not receive the check is bad for him. But at the same time, we must admit that his life did not change as a result. Whether positively he did not get the money, or negatively he will never find out. The mystery of the event's badness, of not receiving the check, again consists in that we must imagine two possible worlds: the actual world, in which Adam did not receive the check, and the possible world in which he did receive it. Then we can ask the question, which of these two worlds is better for Adam? Obviously, it is the possible world in which he did receive the check. Therefore, the fact of not receiving the check did not affect Adam's welfare directly, immediately, but comparatively. If he had received it, his welfare would have been better. Now, let's turn our attention back to death. Death, as I have said, is a kind of experiential emptiness. When we are dead, nothing can come in and determine the content of our experience, because there is no I, there is no you, there are no experiences. But that does not imply that death could not be bad for us. It could be bad for us comparatively, if and to the extent it deprives us of good life. And this conception of the badness of death is known as the deprivation theory, or account of the badness of death. The deprivation and this theory has one important consequence. Let us imagine two persons, S1 and S2, and postulate that S1 dies at 20 and S2 dies at 80 years of age. If we accept a certain average length of a human life, and also the assumption that different human lives are more or less similarly good, then the deprivation conception of the badness of death implies that death is worse, possibly even much worse, for the person S1 than it is for S2. Okay, now with the definition of discrimination and the account of the badness of death at hand, we possess all conceptual tools needed to address the fundamental question of whether harm distribution based on age represents an instance of direct discrimination or not. But first of all, let's imagine the following situation, which I call choice. An AV gets into a collision situation and must choose between two trajectories, T1 and T2. T1 results in the death of a 20 years old person, and while T2 results in the death of a 80 years old person. And not to complicate the matters, let's assume that the probability of death is the same in both cases. In accordance with the ethical system built into its steering algorithm, the AV chooses T2. It hits the older person and kills her. Was it a case of discrimination? Let us notice the first important difference between the choice and discrimination. In instances of discrimination, the agent X mostly has the possibility of actualizing fee, but at the same time she has the option of not acting in this way. A racist has the option of not treating humans of different color differently than those of his own color. A sexist need not treat women differently than men. But, and it's a big difference, I think, the AV in the choice scenario is in a different situation because it cannot choose not to act. It must act, and it has only two options. V1, choosing the trajectory T1 and killing the 20 years old person, or V2, choosing the trajectory T2 and killing the 80 years old. Despite that, it seems at first glance that if AVs acted as the one in the choice scenario, their actions would be instances of discrimination. The 20 years old man belongs to the class P of all 20 years olds, and the 80 years old person belongs to the class Q of all 80 years olds. The AV's action deprives members of Q of an important good, the good of life, and they would therefore be worse off than members of P. The difference in the AV's behavior is based on the property to be of a certain age. But let us now leave aside classes defined by properties, and instead let's designate the younger man A and the older man B. They represent the two classes P and Q, and all that holds for A and B also holds for these classes. As I have emphasized, the AV does not have the option of not acting. It has only two options, and it must choose one of them. Therefore, we cannot compare the situations, for example, when the AV chooses A's death and when it chooses not to act at all, as it can happen, for example, in the case of racism. In other words, we must compare the two choices as if they were actually made. V1, the AV chooses T1 and kills A, and V2, the AV chooses T2 and kills B. And this is where the deprivation conception of the badness of death comes in. The two men differ in age, and it is therefore possible to say that death would be worse for A than for B. That is, it would be comparatively worse. On the other hand, it holds that death would be less bad for B than it would be for A. It would be comparatively, not in itself, better for him. We cannot determine how bad death would be for A and for B, but when we represent the extent of the badness of death for A and B with X and Y, we can write Phi1, AV chooses A, T1, and kills A, and the badness of death is X. And Phi2, AV chooses T2 and kills B, and the badness of her death is Y. And we know that Y is bigger than X. It follows that if the AV chooses Phi2 and kills B, then B is not worse off than A. For the comparison cannot be between the AV chooses Phi2, B dies, and the AV does not choose Phi2, B doesn't die. But between Phi1, A dies, and Phi2, B dies. In other words, we must compare two actions leading to a death of A or B, and then determine for whom the death is worse. And since we know that Y is bigger than X, we must conclude that B is not worse off than A, even when it holds that A survives and B perishes. So let me conclude my presentation by laying an emphasis on the fact that the properties P and Q, or more generally to be of a certain age, are relevantly linked to the actions Phi1 and Phi2. For this property is an instrument through which we can determine the comparative extent of the badness of death. And if my reasoning is correct, then the action described in the choice scenario is not an instance of discrimination based on age. So thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye. Have a nice day.